Hi, thanks so much for joining this video on finding the best way to manage, a video as part of the series for core management concepts. First, we're going to look at Frederick Taylor and his scientific management approach to finding the best way to manage. And what we're interested in for the whole of this mini lecture is thinking about the two competing approaches of Frederick Taylor with scientific management and Mayo with the human relations approach and the Hawthorne studies, and how both of these provide very different perspectives on that question of finding the best way to manage, which we can, of course, also update and think about as a question that is still relevant today, but with this tension playing out between the work of Frederick Taylor and the work of Elton Mayo still going on. In other words, do we just manage people to try and maximize profit and not worry too much about their well-being or their social needs? Or do we take a longer term view and think that paying attention to social needs and being more people-centered will ultimately pay off for the company in the long run, because they will have better customer satisfaction, better worker satisfaction, but then of course also customer satisfaction as a result, potentially better worker loyalty and all the positive things that might go with that. So we start right back at the beginning with this question of finding the best way to manage and looking at the work of Frederick Taylor in the form of scientific management. Frederick Taylor was really interested in improving productivity at work, and he thought a really good way to go about understanding how work could be maximally efficient was by actually studying people doing that work. So Taylor famously observed men shoveling pig iron. If you're not sure what pig iron is, you can Google it, or you can make do with the description I'm about to give you, which is that it's these kind of lumpy nuggets of iron before it's been purified and turned into something that's usable in the industrial process. So he looked for one best way for this task of shoveling pig iron to be performed, and it led to a big revolution in the way we think about work. So what he found was that if you optimize the shovel, you improve the workflow. If you optimize who did what job and how they did it and the layout of the workspace, you also optimized what happened. So the more you played around with these things, you could find one optimal way of organizing the workspace, finding the right employees, and ultimately improving the productivity, all through studying the work, breaking it down and working out what was most effective. And as a result of these types of studies, not just the shoveling of pig iron, a range of other similar studies, he established the principles of scientific management. And those principles are as follows. So firstly, replace a rule of thumb method. By that we mean a manager just choosing what they think is going to be best, instead with a scientific method for each element of work. By scientific management, Taylor is really talking about their observing, carefully noting what's the most efficient and coming up with optimal production. Secondly, scientifically select and then train, teach and develop the workmen. So the use of the word scientifically here is about finding the best person for the job, whether it's because of their physical build or their mental capabilities or whatever it might be, developing them to be excellent at their job and just their job. Thirdly, ensuring cooperation between workers and the managers and the men to ensure all work is done in accordance with the principles. So he believed a good way of doing that was incentives, which is also a principle of scientific management, to incentivize people to do their best work. And also we then have the separation of conception from execution, where managers manage and workers work. This doesn't come from a very positive place, I have to say. So Taylor thought that workers were largely stupid and that managers were very clever. And so you shouldn't get the workers to do any thinking, you should just get them to do pig iron shoveling in the way the managers had decided. So it comes from a bad place, but this idea of conception from execution, where managers manage and workers work, is something that we've already seen in the earlier units of core management concepts. So Taylor's legacy cannot be underestimated. Specifically, his work led on to the more scientifically rooted studies of the Gilbreths, where they undertook time and motion studies to work out the optimal way to do particular tasks. It also led to an idea that the more you can improve workers' body movements, the more you can improve workplace efficiency. So a real obsession over that level of detail. More generally, it encouraged this idea of taking the engineering efficiency approach to the design of work. In other words, don't treat people like people, treat people like machines that can be optimized just as machines can. This sort of idea generated huge returns and really encouraged businesses to go for that sort of approach. Many large businesses adopted these efficiency approaches based on Taylor. What's interesting though is that the research shows that often they didn't adopt them as fully as Taylor suggested. So they didn't go for it totally on all 5 principles, but they took some parts, perhaps, this idea of measuring and taking a scientific approach, for example. And it's also had a big legacy in the discipline of management science, which has come about as a result, and which we'll be looking at in a future unit. One of the most major developments after Taylor, though, was Ford. So Henry Ford, the car manufacturer, you obviously still know that Ford cars are around today. He took the idea of Taylor and this idea of simplifying the production process, but took it to another level. So he simplified tasks right down and made them optimally designed. But he also created the moving assembly line. And he would make the assembly line move along, the workers stay still. So the cars travel to the workers, for the workers to perform their specific task on the car, and then the car moves on further. And this idea of keeping the production line moving at all costs was central to Fordism. He gave very high levels of hourly pay. The $5 a day was introduced by Ford, and that was worth a great deal of money at the time. But he also avoided bonuses. So it was all about paying staff well to do the job well. And those staff would be closely supervised and expected to work very hard and under strict discipline conditions. And he also tried to avoid his workers forming labour unions, with the $5 salary perhaps helping with that and helping reduce the need for disagreement and for labour unions to form in the first place. And again, labour unions is a topic you'll be looking at in a future module. We can still see Taylorism in the workplace today, in the sorts of following features that pervade in contemporary workplaces. Firstly, the idea of finding an optimal way to organise, dictating it, and then overseeing the work by a manager. This idea very much still pervades work, that there can be a set way of doing things, particularly in very simple work. Moving production lines still absolutely exist in car factories, although increasingly staffed by robots as opposed to humans. And thirdly, making idiot-proof equipment and practices. So kind of treating workers as though they don't need to have much ability or much agency other than to just get the task done. So things like in sales call centers saying, follow the script, that's the best way of doing it. Or in fast food kitchens, creating simple cooking processes and highly specialized equipment. So in the brief stint that I worked in McDonald's, when I was much, much younger, there was a very special ketchup squirter with 6 identical holes. Same the world over. It means if you order a hamburger in McDonald's, it's used the same, one of the exact same pieces of tool, you will get the same amount of ketchup and the same McDonald's burger. But scientific management isn't all good. There's a number of problems with it. Firstly, one I've already hinted at is that it really belittled the worker, with the worker being considered stupid and just being seen as being there to labour. This seems very foolish, because surely the worker, as the person doing the work, might have something useful to say about how to improve the work to make it better. So not allowing the worker a voice can actually lead to inefficiencies. Secondly, it creates de-skilled workers, because it creates very, very narrow lines of work where workers have to do a very specific task, because that generally is the optimal way of organising work, because you become highly good at this one routinized part and you don't have to switch between tasks. Whilst it's very good for speeding up labour, it reduces autonomy and self-control of employees. It can lead to mental health problems. It's really quite problematic, because it in turn leads to bored workers who feel dissatisfied, and often they will exit the companies. So turnover can end up being very high as a result. You'll find if you look in many fast food joints or factories, if people have a choice of employment, they may not stay with the same employer in those settings for very long. And then finally, it can create the calculating worker, where Taylor recommended providing good incentives, and Ford also gave good incentives for workers to work hard and to reduce the problems of workers being bored or dissatisfied. Maybe they'll put up with things for longer, but it can create a very calculative approach where workers only work hard when they're being watched, and when they're not, they slack off to try and ease the boredom and to gain back some autonomy and control over their lives. So it has quite negative effects for workers. Workers don't generally enjoy working in highly Tayloristic environments where their autonomy and freedom is removed. So now we can look at a very different approach, but which actually came about from a very similar place, and that's the Hawthorne studies and the human relations approach. So this These are based on studies at Western Electric, which was a large factory, as you can see from this picture. The studies took place from 1924 to 1933, so unbelievably, they're nearly 100 years old. And they were by Elton Mayo and a team of researchers who were really interested in the psychological elements of human behaviour. So in line with those interests on how to optimise performance by designing work in a particular way, Mayo and his colleagues thought about how you might want to optimise work around the psychology of the human being as well. So there'd been studies that had taken place in World War I, looking at how UK soldiers, how you could reduce the absenteeism of UK soldiers, for example, through combinations of work and rest periods. So tapping into the psychology, how can you tune someone's psychological makeup and make use of that in the best possible way when you design work? So they looked at how to mould individuals to perform optimally through outside intervention, so rest periods, nice office spaces, social time, etc. So it's coming from quite a Tayloristic perspective, but it's not so much about controlling the actual work, it's about controlling outside interventions and thinking about how you can shape the wraparound of work to create optimal working conditions. There were a range of different studies. We'll just look at the first couple very quickly because they're less relevant to us. The first study was on the illumination test, so focusing on a part of the factory that were creating items that you needed good lighting for, and they subjected groups to different variations in lighting. They found it didn't really have much of an impact. Then they had the relay test, which involves experimental alteration of bonus arrangements, rest periods, and hours of work. And they found that there was a continuous increase over this period, which then got labelled the Hawthorne effect, and it meant that participants in research behaved differently than they would do normally. Now, a big caveat with this, that whilst that's a very interesting finding and useful if you're studying a research module, it's not particularly helpful on this module. It's not going to give you very much. It's not going to deliver much in terms of understanding about management. So don't be tempted to write in detail on the Hawthorne effect. If you get a question on the Hawthorne studies, you are going off in the wrong direction and you will not be rewarded with good marks. What we would like you to talk about instead is study 3, which is the bank wiring room experiments. So in these experiments, a group of 14 people were observed in the Hawthorne factory, and 2 cliques were noticed across 3 formal groups. So in other words, the group of 14 was split into 3 subgroups officially, but there were actually 2 cliques or 2 like informal groups within that group of 14. And these groups had informal norms and informal enforcement mechanisms. So in other words, they had set ways of operating that they had decided that weren't anything to do with the company. And cliques were shown in the research to operate below their abilities. So they were not doing as much as they possibly could, and they therefore weren't earning as much as they should be able to. But they had chosen this as a social group, and that those social norms and staying a part of the gang was seen to be more important to those people than working really hard at maximising your profit. So the sorts of clique norms that were found were: you shouldn't turn out too much work, because if you do, you're a rate buster. You shouldn't turn out too little work, because if you do, you're a chiseler. You shouldn't tell a supervisor anything that might get a colleague into trouble, lest you might be labelled a squealer. And you shouldn't attempt to maintain social distance. That means something quite different today, but social distance in the sense of kind of distancing yourself from your group, or act officiously, so kind of acting more senior than other people. So if you're an inspector, you might be an inspector, but you shouldn't act like an inspector. And so these social norms were found to be incredibly strong, stronger than the payment incentive of working harder. So Elton Mayo concluded that work is an activity that, even if it's people doing individual tasks, work is an activity nonetheless performed by groups. Even if the work undertaken is ostensibly individual work, it's groups who are doing it, because the social group at work is important for workers who are looking to fulfill their needs. There might be needs for belonging, communication, community, participation, interaction, etc., etc. And managers need to collaborate with informal work groups, not just the formal ones, but informal work groups, to increase cohesion and to benefit the company. So all of these things interrelate, and we will learn more about this in the unit on human resource management, in particular the legacy of this kind of work. Just to say something very briefly about it, the key thing is that these conclusions led to the development of the human relations approach, where rather than treating workers like machines, as scientific management and Taylorism had, managers instead were shown that they needed to understand how work is a social place for individuals, and indeed a way that individuals meet their needs for belonging and group membership. And it's also a way to establish social identity. And so seeing work not just as a vehicle for earning money, but actually as doing other things as well, encourages a very people-centered approach. And so Mayo and the Hawthorne studies are fundamental to the human resource management function and to looking after people in the organisation, and also to the academic discipline of organisational behaviour, which you may come across in a future module. So what we could say then is that we've got two very competing early approaches to the management of people. There's Taylor and there's Mayo. Taylor is very much people as machines, optimize performance, etc. Mayo is very much about look after people. It will ultimately benefit you. Pure Tayloristic companies today would focus on performance and ignore an employee's psychological and social needs altogether, other than the need for money. A pure human relations company today would focus on psychological and social needs to a very high degree and ignore the need for other aspects of performance optimization, such as process improvement. As you can see, both of these extremes are too extreme. They're ignoring the benefits that the other brings. And so there's an argument to be made for an approach that is somewhere in the middle. And to choose two examples that are still very much at either end of the spectrum, but nonetheless take some interest in the other elements too. McDonald's, the fast food restaurant, is highly Tayloristic, but it still provides great opportunities for group cohesion, training, and self-development. So McDonald's University is a really fundamental part. If you work there for a long time, you will be asked if you would like to attend training courses, you can do apprenticeships and so forth. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got a creative company who might focus heavily on social cohesion and individual motivation because they see those as a route to creativity and innovation, the types of things that their customers are perhaps paying them for. But it would be crazy if they didn't look for efficiency savings. They will still be looking for those. So it's the rare creative company that has gone through the recent pandemic and hasn't thought about things like downsizing or changing the way that they work to focus on efficiency savings too. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this session and I hope you will be looking at the future ones. Take care. Bye.